Hi, what lurks beneath. I just discovered your channel rather recently and have a story you might find of interest. This is a true story and happened back in a time where no one knew about this kind of stuff. I mean, there was Bigfoot, but I always thought that was just a hoax. This would have been in 93 or 94. I was a teenager at the time and my family was celebrating my little niece's 5th birthday. My aunt and uncle had a monstrous-sized backyard that sat practically on a hillside. It was in the summertime, and all the kids were outside playing. We hadn't cut the cake yet, or done presents. So I'm sitting there, bored as ever, and I feel the need to relieve myself. Thinking that it's just faster to trot over to the trees and let nature happen than go back into the house. I do just that. No one is really paying attention, and I go just a few trees in to where you can't quite see me. I take a whiz, and as I'm walking back out of the woods, as soon as I take a step out of the woods back to my aunt and uncle's backyard, I lock eyes with something. Whatever eyes I was looking at were across the yard and the trees over there, closer to where the kids were playing, probably no more than 3 to 4 trees back. These were large eyes and looked angry, very intense. They glowed this evil amber color. I made out that they were high up off the ground and whatever they belonged to was much larger than I. I felt like I was lost in a trance with them momentarily when I felt my stomach knot up. I felt sick. I didn't know what they belonged to, and I didn't even think. I felt an overwhelming sense of danger and began making a huge scene, waving my arms and hollering, screaming and yelling at the top of my lungs. Half my family didn't even bother to stop what they were doing and look at me. The others just thought I was being crazy. I got the children's attention though, and my niece just looked confused. I started pointing and yelling something is watching us through the trees over there. Some of my family turned and looked to see what I was talking about. Some of them must have seen it, because after I said that, some of my family began screaming, pointing, and panicking. I just see this flurry of children being scooped up and brought inside while other family members who didn't see it exchanged confused and concerned glances. I didn't bother to look up and see if it was still there myself. Instead, I briskly headed to the house as everybody else did, or at least most of my family. Inside, I was met with fearful looks and whispering. My uncle was already on the phone with the police. We're all staring outside the back window to my other family coming in and yelling at them to hurry up. There's something out there. Half of us are staring at the woods behind them, when like a choir, everybody starts shouting and shrieking in unison. We all saw it with our own eyes. A living werewolf stepped out into the open, looked up in our general direction, dropped down to all fours, and ran off in the opposite direction. I use the term werewolf because that's exactly what it looked to be. The sheer size alone was terrifying, enough to make a grown man's knees tremble. It reminded me of an upright walking bison until I saw its very wolf-like features. That should give you a good reference for its size. Then, the fact that it was faster than lightning striking was traumatic in its own right. It was blacker than midnight, and it is forever burned into my memory banks. Something weird that I remember is when it dropped down to all fours, it seemed as if it wasn't able to do that. Its massive arms were much larger than its back legs, and its back legs didn't look right. After it bolted off, everybody is howling and yelling. The kids were crying, convinced that whatever we saw was going to come and get us. I was in such a state of shock I couldn't believe what we had all just seen. My aunt spent a while trying to calm the children down, telling them it wasn't going to get them. I'll never forget my niece crying and telling me she never wants to go back outside again. This was the worst birthday she'd ever had. It was heartbreaking. My uncle was still on the phone with the police, and he's going insane now, screaming and breaking down, saying there's a monster behind his house. We were all frightened. We had no idea what any of us had just seen. We were all so afraid. Much of that evening is a blur because I feel my brain tried to block it out. In the same way, The brain acts as a defense mechanism for trauma. I didn't even think my niece remembered it. Lucky her. I tried not to reflect back on these memories too much. It bothers me to even think about that thing watching my niece and her friends play. God knows what it was planning to do to her. This was just about 3 or 4 weeks ago. I work for a larger bread company. I won't say the name, but I bet you've eaten their bread at some point. I make drive one of the bigger trucks that delivers the bread, so I get sent all over the state. I was heading to my destination, which was about 3 hours away from where I work. I'm driving on this 2-lane highway, not much other traffic around. It was starting to become dusk outside. There was light out, but not quite enough to turn your lights on. I have pretty good vision, so I don't personally feel the need to have lights on as soon as it gets a little dusky. I'm driving down this long stretch of road. It's pretty straightforward. It goes down this long sloping hill and flattens out. If you looked out straight, you could probably see about 3 miles of the road before it curves off far in the distance. On both sides of the road, there are maybe 20 feet of just dirt and grass, followed by thick forest on both sides. There are no neighborhoods, no houses, no turnoffs, nothing. There's no reason anybody should be out here, costume or no costume. As the road is flattening out at the bottom of this long slope, I see movement off to my right. I'm in the zone, listening to music and watching the road, but not intensely. You know how when you drive, you're paying attention, but you kind of just get lost in thought. It's an autopilot thing, you know? I was doing that, and this large shape, what I thought was a person, very quickly steps into view and on the road. Stops and turns its head to face me. I don't notice it enough in time, and I go to slam on my brakes and collide with this thing. I'm doing 50 miles an hour, and I'm carrying a full load. It was way too fast for me to stop any collision from happening. As soon as my truck hit this thing, it disappeared. I jumped in my seat, pulling over as fast as I could while I tried to just collect myself and digest what just happened. I'm pulled over on the side of the road, jump out of my truck and begin looking around. I'm frantic, I'm panicked. I don't even know what the hell just happened and why it vanished. I don't see a damn thing. It's still light enough at this point I can see there were no signs of anything ever being on the road or around it. I checked the front of my vehicle. Nothing. I was going crazy. I saw this thing with my 2 eyes, felt the impact and heard the noise. Where did its body go? I didn't run it over, and it certainly didn't fly over my truck. It was just gone. Whatever it was, I only got a quick glimpse at it. It had a wolf head and face, and walked on 2 legs just as a person did. I remember seeing big teeth and longer limbs, but that's it. It all happened so fast. It was tall. My delivery truck isn't short by any means, and this thing's face was level with mine in the truck. So, maybe 10 feet tall? I don't know. It was such a big shape when it came out of the woods and cleared the gap between the road and the trees within just a second or two. The wilderness around me wasn't extremely dense. You could see if someone was backing a little bit or hiding. I just don't understand what even happened. Was this a demon? Did I see things? Was it an optical illusion? It certainly wasn't a person in a costume, and if it was, where did it go? Why did it vanish? I'm still trying to even process what happened, but every time I talk about my story, it gets a little easier for me. I hope this makes sense to you. It's therapeutic. I don't have many other details to give you other than what I already have, so let me know if you have any questions about what happened. Let me first explain that every Christmas, my family has a massive get-together where everyone flies out. We all meet up at my grandmother's house for a few days and just do general Christmas stuff. It's been an ongoing tradition for years and years. Due to this, I am now very close with many of my family that I wouldn't normally see all year round and can actually keep relationships. My cousin, who lives up on the East Coast in eastern Pennsylvania, is quite the character. I'll call him Dan for this story. Dan has told me some interesting information, and him and I are very close, like I said. I feel like he is able to fully confide in me. He knows that I know he is rational and not crazy. It took him a couple of drinks to really open up and tell me what happened. Even as he was telling me, he got shaken up. His attitude and demeanor changed, and that's why ultimately I believe him. You can't fake a reaction like what I witnessed of his. Unless, of course, he's an Oscar award-winning actor. I don't know if you want to call it a cabin, but he owns this little house, about 50 or so miles away from his own. This cabin, we'll call it, is tucked away thick into the Tioga State Forest. There's no running water, no electricity. I'm not even sure who really knows about it. He built this cabin himself years ago when he was younger, as a getaway for him. I've been to it before. It's pretty well built, but doesn't have much to it. Now that you understand that portion, the next portion is essentially what he explained to me. During this time, it was just him and I sitting together outside with the rest of the family inside. I was smoking a cigarette, and he just got lost in conversation when he started to tell me about it, asking me if I could listen to what he had to say and believe it. He told me that he was up there with this girl he's been dating back in September. I guess they went on a few days of a vacation getaway. Sometime during the night, they were startled by a noise outside. Thinking it was just an animal, they ignored it and tried to go back to sleep. This animal, or whatever it was outside, continuously acted more and more aggressive, to the point to where the front door was forced and broken down, and this animal entered the cabin. This is the part where my cousin has a really hard time retelling and shuts down. He says as it broke into the cabin, it was like this large hairy wolf creature. It had too many teeth for its mouth, all razor sharp and glowing eyes. The fear alone he felt nearly drove him insane. His eyes were welting up, and he was holding back tears as he's explaining this to me. Says it must have been the grace of God that allowed him to escape without getting mauled. His woman and he were able to manage to get into his car and getting out of there before this thing got to them. What I didn't quite understand myself was how if it broke into the cabin, how it wasn't able to get to him and his girlfriend in time. But I didn't want to keep pushing information out of him when it was clearly traumatic. He did break down at the end, telling me about this, and he just kept saying, I didn't think things like that existed in our woods. Why did nobody ever tell me about these things? Why does everyone tell you monsters don't exist? It scared me to the core to see how much it was affecting him. I tried to quickly change the subject and bring him out of it, which took a little bit, but worked eventually. I wanted to know more, but it was too hard on him. I'm scared because I don't know what on earth he saw out there. It makes me very hesitant to ever step foot in the woods myself, and if that kind of animal is truly lurking around. As he finished up his story, I was silent. How do you even respond to somebody telling you that and reacting the way he did? It ruined my night. Not only to know that those kind of monsters exist, but to see my cousin so distraught over something that happened months ago. He probably hasn't even been back. I do talk to him often on Facebook, but I really just don't have the heart to ask him more about it and put him through that pain again. My grandparents used to own a big ranch down in southwestern Missouri. My grandfather was a renowned cattle rancher in the area years back. But my grandparents sold their ranch and gave it up after several tragedies had befallen the family, and they just weren't able to do it anymore. These are all things that my grandmother, who is still alive, told me about. My grandfather passed away from a heart attack back in 2001. Bless his soul. My grandmother and grandfather got married back in the 1940s and started their own cattle ranch in that part of the state of Missouri. That's also not long before my father was born. My grandfather grew up with his daddy, ranching in Texas, so it was a tradition he wanted to keep. It's all he knew. That was the life they lived. Well, years after they had my father, their cattle started getting picked off left and right. My grandparents feared for the worst and suspected it was a pack of wolves killing their cows. They were right, to an extent. They had friends who also maintained a couple of ranches here and there, and knew that wolves would be a general problem. This is around the time where they were heavily poached and killed, driving them out of the state. This was still in the 1940s, so right before the mass poaching of wolves happened. The wolves that were killing my grandparents' cows, however, were much different, my grandmother explained to me. They were easily triple in size, jet black, and were about 8 to 9 of them, with one big alpha male. My grandmother vividly remembers these animals tearing through the cattle like they were made of paper. Grandpa shot at them multiple times, but they were such large, vicious predators, it didn't do anything. Eventually, my grandfather started choosing which cows to sacrifice in hopes that these wolves would leave the rest of his cattle alone. He would pick a cow and pull it out to the edge of the ranch and stake it down there. They only ever experienced this activity near the corner of their property. These wolves wouldn't come close, but they were so large, even from afar you could see them clearly. My grandparents didn't know what they were, other than just really large wolves, or a subspecies of them or something. Shortly after these things started showing up and eating the cattle, other things started happening. This was ongoing while my grandfather continuously sacrificed his other cattle to try and keep these things at bay. They had another son shortly after my father, but died of unknown circumstances at 6 weeks old. A couple of weeks afterward, my grandfather came down with a near-death illness that put him out for weeks. Several of his cows would randomly drop dead, with no known causes of death, nor showing any symptoms of reasons to why they died. They would wake up in the middle of the night feeling like they were about to die, this horrible feeling of danger and a fight or flight sense. They would feel these heavy waves of static electricity in the early morning hours. Not all the time, not every night, but often. Weird things like this continued to happen for months. One of their hired ranchers died of a heart attack during this time too. Another mystery because he was young, about 24, 25. A couple of their dogs went missing, never showed up again. All 9 of their cats, which were used for mice catching and just around, disappeared, vanished. No trace of them ever again. We never saw them. My grandmother, whose memory is still very good, says it was from around May or spring to October. Just as soon as all this started happening and the wolves showed up, it all ended. She says it just stopped one day. The weirdness, the static in the air, constantly feeling like somebody was looking over your shoulder. It's as if this darkness was just lifted from their ranch. She said in those few months they lost 100 to 200 cattle easily, probably more. It devastated them. They sold their ranch and the house with it that winter and moved away. My grandmother recalls that time as some of the worst times of their lives and believes it was a curse of some sort. My grandmother is very superstitious and believes that somebody in town that knew them was jealous of their success, thus cursing them and their ranch. I don't know if my grandparents had any bad blood with anybody in town. My grandmother never mentioned anything of the likes, but you never know. I certainly don't know what to make of it myself. It's an interesting story. My grandmother, though, isn't the type to make up fiction and isn't too keen on nonsense. She comes from a very strict generation. She still has old pictures of the ranch they had at the time, and some of their horses and other livestock. This was long before my time. My father was too young to remember the ranch because, when they moved, he was probably still under 7 years old. Anyway, I just wanted to share this with you because it's just so interesting. It sounds like Dogman activity to me. I didn't tell my grandmother that. She would have no idea what it is. I don't even think I've ever mentioned Bigfoot around her, so I don't know how she feels about that. The descriptions and events she gave me lines up with some sort of Dogman UFO-like activity. Freaky, to say the least. I'll start off by saying that I live in northern Arizona, just a tad outside the small town of Holbrook, very close to the little Colorado River. I don't know exactly how familiar you are with Holbrook or any of the surrounding areas, but it's a vast wasteland of nothingness, which, if you seek solace in the desolate, it's a wonderful thing. Something weird has been going on through this past year, though. Before I jump right into that, let me give you some of the details. It's almost impossible to live down here and not be somewhat immersed in Navajo culture and tradition. I'm well aware of skinwalkers and that they are very much a thing here. Personally, I haven't really had any encounters with them myself, but know many individuals who have. I am also close friends with these individuals, so I know the signs to look out for. But something I don't quite understand is some of the things that are taking place. I'm sure many of you know that Arizona and much of the southwestern US have a very healthy population of coyotes. It's often that you will hear them howling in the distance and outside. This is not an uncommon thing. In the past year, though, I've been hearing them less and less, and these weird yipping and crying noises, these pained cries, fearful cries. Nothing that I'm used to hearing from these animals. It's strange. I have no plausible explanation. It was only a few weeks after I started hearing these things that I actually saw my first dead coyote, not far from where I live. Its spine was completely snapped in half with its 2 front legs, ripped entirely off its body. It couldn't have been too old, maybe a few days at most. The sun and dry heat had mummified it, but I was surprised to see that it didn't even have a smell. Much of its gut and back legs had huge bite marks taken out of it. Looked like a fucking shark took chunks out of this thing. The meat wasn't ripped off the bone, as you would see with traditional kills from predators. Whatever killed and ate this coyote took literal chunks of flesh and meat off the carcass. A shark came to my mind as the only living thing that I think can take chunks of meat off an animal like that. Whatever it had to have been was very large, far larger than a coyote. We don't have bears down here to my knowledge. Bears also don't eat coyotes. Not like this one, how it was killed and eaten. It was extremely strange. I'm not sure how coyotes' front legs get ripped off and its spine snapped. This was over a half a mile away from any roads, so I'm not sure how its death truly occurred. In the next month, I continued to hear the crying, whining, and yipping. The howls that I was so used to hearing were becoming less and less. I started having friends mentioning to me that they thought it was strange, the large uptick of dead coyotes around the area. I expressed what I found to a close friend when he and another family member also expressed to me similar findings. I know some talk about it being a skinwalker, but I don't think a skinwalker does this, or do they? I'm an avid explorer of the wilderness. I always have been. I've seen strange things out there. One of the strangest things I've seen is when I was out in North Florida, kayaking through the Everglades and thick swamp. I saw what I believed to be some sort of dog humanoid. As I'm rowing my kayak, I see this dog head watching me from the groves closely. I was semi-floating closer to it, but also coming around a bend in the swamp. Its head followed my movement, never breaking eye contact with me, and never moved a muscle other than its head to intently watch me. I matched its intensity with me maintaining eye contact with it. I wasn't scared. I wasn't going to back down. I was curious and in a mild state of shock at what I was seeing. It looked to be like a canine humanoid, about average human height, 6 feet I'd say, covered in brown matted fur, had a shallow snout and a canine-like face. The body was more humanoid. It had a larger chest, lots of rippling muscles. It used its arms like a person, the way it was holding down the brush in front of it to see me. I couldn't clearly see its hands. Its eyes were either black or dark in color. I knew it was looking right at me the whole time. It had a startled expression on its face, like it wasn't expecting a person to be showing up and coming through the area. I'll admit, I have no idea if others come into this area, as I was just randomly exploring uncharted areas. I think it took this creature off course when it saw me. It probably has never seen other humans. Winter in 2010. My brother and I go scouting in the mountains in Colorado. My brother was doing some videography work for a client he was working closely with, scouting out areas to shoot in the woods. I can't remember if it was a possible music video or what kind of shoot it was. He knew I loved venturing out and we always worked close together, especially when it came to his job. His job for this little venture was to scout out some good shooting locations. We went pretty off-road. I'm not native to Colorado or the area we were at, so I can't recall any specific roads. I do remember, though, we had come across several logging roads that were close to main roads, and then followed several game trails beyond that. My brother didn't want to venture too far in, because it had to be close enough for lugging equipment back and forth. We were looking for a clearing that was off of a game trail, or just tucked away enough from the mass amount of people that would want to come through. We ended up following this small game trail off of a very old logging road, not even half a mile, I want to say. It was a smaller meadow. It was beautiful, even with all the snow and in the middle of winter. My brother loved the location. Took several pictures when his camera died and ceased to turn back on. He always brought extra batteries with him. He was always very prepared. We sat there while he tried his different battery combinations, growing more and more frustrated with each time. His camera wouldn't turn on. He was convinced it had just given out on him, taken a shit. Angry and in a foul mood, we were leaving the area when I spotted massive canine prints in the snow. They were perpendicular to the small game trail. I don't know how we didn't see them before. They looked pretty fresh. They were large enough for my brother and I to both be astonished at the size alone. We didn't know wolves got that big out here. Kinda freaked us out, so we got out of there pretty quickly. It was Mother's Day in 2015, and I was coming back from taking my mother to a day at the beach. My dad passed away years ago, and my mom and I still remain really close. I don't live near my mother. My career actually takes me across the US, so I live in states away with my own life, but love to reconnect with her as much as I can. This Mother's Day was special. I treated her out to a wonderful day on the coast. Went and did a bunch of sightseeing that we don't normally get to see. The day went wonderful. We were driving back to her house to relax for the evening when my mom is really fixated on something outside of her window. We're driving on a long, winding road, and I asked her what she's looking at, and she keeps asking me if I saw that. I asked her, see what? I look over, and out of the tall grass see this large dog-like shape coming out of the brush and back into the trees like it was looking for something. That's what it was acting like, at least. Both my mother and I were puzzled at what we were looking at. Keep in mind, I couldn't keep direct eye contact on it like my mother could since I was driving. I don't know if anybody else saw it, though. It was in the evening time, so it was just now starting to get dark. We both clearly saw something we could not explain that looked canine-like. I have no idea what it could have been. The shape didn't make sense. It wasn't exactly the shape of a dog wandering around, and it wasn't exactly the shape of a person either. It was something in between. It was large. Large enough to easily be the size of a bear, but it didn't look anything like a bear. It moved oddly, almost as if it was in a gliding motion. At first, my mom thought it was some kind of bear until we realized the head and the snout and the ears were that of a dog. Mother and I were more puzzled than anything else, and weren't sure why it kept coming out of the brush, looking down at the ground. Was it following a mouse? It was odd behavior. I thought I'd send this story to you anyway because it was weird and seems to fall with some of the stuff you talk about on your show.